Good morning, everyone. It is just the top of the hour, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. My name is Michael Barber. We're going to kick off in just about 2 minutes. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to hop in. And if you're just joining us, we're giving everyone about an additional minute to hop into the GoToWebinar, and then we'll get started. All right, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you find yourself in the world. My name is Michael Barber, and minus being your host today, I work on the content and marketing team at Charter School Capital. We want to take a moment before we start just to acknowledge the resilience and innovation and all the hard work almost everyone on this call has been putting in over the last few months. Education is a challenging space, and if we can get through the last 3 months, we know we will be able to get through and survive and thrive into the future. So a dear thank you from us for putting in the work and continuing to put in all the hard work that you and your team is to make sure that your students are educated, safe, and have somewhere to come back to next year. Over the past couple of months, we've been developing content to help you ensure that you survive and thrive over the coming months. We'll continue to do that starting today, where we're going to be talking about how to create a plan for success, how you can ensure that you survive and thrive amidst what will be likely budget cuts, deferrals, and/or delays, depending upon what state you're in. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this webinar, and to the individual Lori who asked us just a second ago, will we be providing the PowerPoint and slides along with the recording? The answer to that question is yes. We will be sending these out to you this afternoon, so look for that in your inbox. If you don't see it in your inbox, you can feel free to find us on social media. We're at Grow Charters on Twitter, as well as Charter School Capital on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. We'll be sharing the resources there too. On that note, let me just take a quick moment to introduce you to our speakers today. We're joined today by two of my colleagues, Tricia Blum and Matt Person. Tricia spent over decades of time in transactional law before looking for educational changes for both of her teenage sons in 2013. From there, she found a charter school to help them get the resources they need to get better education in their lives, and decided to join a charter management organization where she was the COO and general counsel of that organization. She went on to become the CEO of a 7-campus charter in Southern California. And as our VP of Business Consulting, she makes sure and advises all of our charter leaders across the country that we're working with on a daily basis. We're also joined by my colleague, Matt Person, who's the manager of financial analysis and risk. Matt brings over a decade of risk and finance analysis and experience, largely within the charter school space. He joined us in 2013, right at the edge the end of the last recession, and has been providing insights and counsel to our schools on how they can get through what will likely be another recession as we think about reopening our schools and into the 2020-2021 school year. Again, we are recording the webinar, and we'll make sure you get all these resources at the conclusion of our time today. We thank you for taking the time to join us, and I'm going to turn it over to Tricia to take you through what we're going to talk through today. Tricia?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for such a nice introduction. I appreciate that. And I do agree. Thank you to all the schools for working so hard in these unprecedented times. So today we're going to spend a little time talking about the current fiscal situation, considerations for schools. We're going to do a case study with financial paths and share some anecdotes around those. And then we'll wrap it up and open it up for questions. We expect it should take about an hour for all of that. So here we go. Charter school fiscal situation. Here on your screen, you can see the United States, and it's in lots of colors. What we've done is taken all of the information we've been able to gather over the last several weeks and come up with sort of a map, literally, of the United States that shows recent decisions that could cause disruptions to your school. And as we all know, more will come over this summer and likely through the fall and the rest of the year. So you can see there are two lucky states in white, South Carolina and Arkansas, that cuts and deferrals are unlikely. And I should take a moment and say deferrals, for those of you that are not familiar with them because you're lucky enough to be in states that have not suffered it, is essentially where either the state or your county or local school board decides to hold back a piece or all of your monthly funding and pay it to you later in the fiscal year. And so sometimes it's from one month to the next, and some months it can be several months out. So you can see that we are anticipating at Charter School Capital that cuts and deferrals are likely in Arizona and California. You can see Minnesota on my screen. The blue is very, very similar to the other dark blue. Thank you, Michael. Minnesota deferrals are likely there. And then in the indigo or navy, dark navy states, budget cuts are likely. The gray states, no charter law. And then the other states, unknown or still uncertain enough to really call. But that's what we're looking at Charter School Capital, and that's what we're helping schools sort of prepare for coming into the fall. Next slide, thank you. So the interesting and somewhat good news is that while disruptive, if history tells us anything, funding levels will recover. You can see in 2008, when the Great Recession started, the per pupil state funding median was $6,357 per pupil. You can see it decreased slightly in 2009, and then it dropped dramatically in 2010, remained at those low levels at $59.26, $59.20, and then $59.56 in 2013, before finally rebounding in 2014. It got back to 2008 levels and then a little, and you can see it's increased since then. We don't know that in this case it will take this long for our budget cuts and deferrals to work through our school system, and we hope the recovery is faster, but this should give you an idea of what the recovery looks like. It's likely not just this year, but for a few years to come. So what we decided based on trying to figure out where we should use, what state we should use for examples, we picked California because we know it's facing cuts and deferrals pretty close to what I would call the worst case example for all the states. So we know in California that we're facing budget cuts and deferrals. And so we're going to use it as our example today. And our example numbers we're using is a 10% reduction from previously forecasted per pupil state funding. And what that is it's a 7.92% reduction from fiscal year 20 plus the COLA. So in fiscal year 21, we expect a 10% reduction, and we expect no Q4 fiscal year 20 payments. In California, we receive state revenue in many forms, and so we're anticipating that one of our forms just plain old won't be paid. And then we are expecting 3 months of deferrals. In fact, we're anticipating that there are potentially deferrals even this month that we will miss part or all of our June payment and will not be repaid until July or August. I know when this first occurred in 2008 and 9, one of our client schools said that they suffered deferrals for almost an entire year. They started the deferral in July, and they were not paid that deferral until June. So they went, 11 years and 3 weeks. So deferrals, we're not sure exactly what they're going to look like, but they typically run month to month or a few months out. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? We have kind of a pick a path, and Matt's going to spend some time talking about it. I'm going to spend some time talking about it. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about surviving and thriving. So much of what we're doing right now is, puts survival at the top of mind. We're just trying to get through it. We're just trying to get through the last few months. We know it's going to be a bumpy fall. It's going to be a tough summer. And so we're just really trying to survive. But most of us didn't get involved in the charter community. Certainly you leaders didn't get involved in education or charter schools to just survive. You didn't get in it to just maintain cash balance and to just pay your teachers. You got in it to really thrive, to support your community, your students, your teachers, your families. Most of you got in it because you saw an opportunity to deliver better education to your community and provide support to students and families, and develop and improve staff and grow and expand your mission. And so we really want to talk about how to support schools in thriving today. So we're going to talk about a case study. We're actually going to talk about 4, but specifically spend some time on 2 of them. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Tricia. All right, so let's actually look at a case study. So we're going to walk through several slides, and we're essentially putting ourselves in your shoes right now. In your shoes as somebody who's running a charter school. You're right now in the summer. You're facing intense pressure about budget cuts. There could be payment deferrals in your state, and likely some of that is not finalized yet. And it's in the summer month, and you guys likely have to start getting your budgets finalized and turned into your authorizers. So let's look at a case study and walk through a few potential paths that you may very well be thinking about taking for next fiscal year. So we're going to use a California school as an example, and I'm going to set the baseline stage to talk about how the school is in fiscal 20. So this current year that's just wrapping up. So this school had 630 students. They have total annual revenues of just under $9 million. Their total expense base for the year is $9.2 million. So you can see from an operating surplus or deficit standpoint, they're running a pretty marginal deficit of $250,000. And one thing that's worth noting is this school is ending fiscal year 20 at a pretty substantial cash balance of over $500,000. So that is the label of the plan prior to COVID-19. So let's walk through a few other things. So Tricia highlighted the macro view of the United States right now, how all the impacts are most likely going to play out for all the different states that have charter law. This is specifically reiterating the points about California. One thing we know is that they have essentially an 8% net reduction in funding levels per student. There is a missing payment for the end of the year, which for some schools can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's just not going to come in the first week of July. There's likely up to 3 months of payments out of 12 that are going to be deferred from anywhere from 1 month up to 3 or 4 months. And then there's all the other things that you guys are likely thinking about with running and reopening your school this coming fall. All the virus-related cleaning, all the additional staffing for things around COVID-19, remote learning environments, Chromebooks. There's a lot of considerations going on. So, giving all of that, let's think about 3 distinct paths that you may be thinking about taking. The second one, which is in the orange bubble on the right side of the screen, is keeping the same enrollment and same expense structure as you had planned, assuming COVID-19 never occurred. It never had any impact on the economy. It never had any impact on your state and school budget. The next path forward that likely a lot of you are considering to some degree in light blue is expense cuts to offset the revenue impact. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is if your actual annual 12-month revenue is going to be reduced by $1.2 million, you would simply do a mathematical equation to say, I need to remove that same dollar amount in my expense line items to make things net neutral. So how about a different path? So at the bottom of the screen in dark blue, there's a fourth option that you may be considering or thinking about in the back of your mind, which is financing with no expense cuts. So one more thing, can you go back just a second, Michael? So one thing to note on that is that I want to be clear on, when I say finance and no cuts, I mean simply the plan you had as a charter school prior to COVID-19, you're going to keep that exactly the same. You're not going to have to remove any expenses, and you're going to use financing to fill the gap of the revenue offset from the budget cuts. So you can go to the next slide, Michael. Okay, so this is no expense cuts. So this is essentially a graph representing two distinct plans. One is the plan prior to COVID-19, which would just mean none of the budget effects actually ever occurred. COVID-19 isn't a thing, so we know that plan is actually out of the window because that's no longer the situation. So the next path we're talking about is taking no action on part of your budget. You're going to accept all of the budget cuts that get, that actually fall onto your school, but you're not going to make any changes to offset by expense cutting or taking any other action. So this is a graphical representation monthly for 12 months for fiscal year 21, looking at ending cash balance in your operating account as a charter school. So this red line is simply $0 cash balance every month. So you could think about that as any time cash falls below the red line, you're going to have issues. You're going to miss payroll. There's going to be vendors that have issues because you don't have enough money to pay them. So taking no action, you can see that the school actually runs out of money in the first month and never recovers. So no expense cuts is also not a viable option. Okay, so we talked about the plan prior to COVID-19. That's out the window. We just quickly walk through what happens if you take simply no action at all. That also doesn't work. It's going to have short-term effects that are going to be so quickly to hit you as a school that it's going to make opening up in the fall detrimental. Given the fact that, remember, we're still talking about this California example that's facing reductions of 10% and deferrals. You may very well be in a state that is facing very minimal budget cuts or something different. So that, just remember that we're talking about California. So path forward number 3. What about if you just simply think about cutting expenses to offset the revenue impact? That's probably the first thing that crosses everybody's mind because it's the easiest thing to come to a conclusion on. If someone tells you that you're going to get 10% less money than you did last year, the first logical thing you will think is, I should probably spend 10% less. That makes sense. That's the first thing that crosses your mind. So this is the same graphical representation of cash. So what you will notice in the light blue line is that mathematically, this actually works. You could cut over 10% of your expenses from your budget and make it work. But the question you have to ask yourself is that setting you up for anything in the future that could be detrimental to the program?
Thanks, Matt. So as you saw in Matt's graph, we cut 12% from the budget, which equaled about $1.2 million in expense cuts. And when we put that into what does that really look like, we came up with 15 teachers and staff. So you could do that. And of course, it might be more depending on how much you pay your teachers and staff. Or you could look to cut some of your athletic programs or all of your athletic programs. And not an or, but and your arts program and after school programs. or a combination thereof. I know when I was the CEO of our CMO, our challenge really was where should we cut, as we knew we needed to make cuts. And we did. We cut some teachers and staff, and then we started cutting programs. And we changed our dynamic art program to a less dynamic art program. And we asked our teachers to step up and work through the art program themselves, as opposed to paying a third-party vendor to come in and do some really amazing programs. And then we were a school founded with a mission to teach a second language starting in kindergarten. And we offered 3 languages, Chinese, Spanish, and Hebrew. You can imagine that those parents that wanted their children to learn a second language from early on were really interested in our school. And we took the live teaching aspect of our foreign language program and we turned it into an online program, which, sadly for elementary school kids, proved to be pretty difficult and challenging. And so they just weren't getting the same type of foreign language experience that they had received prior to our cuts. So again, each school will have to figure out what it is that what programs they need to cut and what staff they may need to cut in order to cut out all the expenses to continue to survive. So to go to that, I just gave you a real world example of, potential academic decline based on a school cutting its budget. And this slide illustrates what the academic or intellectual piece of what I've just shared. And it is based on a series of studies. If you're interested in reading those studies or the white papers, please reach out. We'll make sure we get you the information so you can actually read the documents themselves. But essentially what we found was that the studies tracked student achievement during the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, and it found, no surprise, that school funding declines were associated with student achievement declines, and that school spending increases were associated with improvements in student achievements. So no surprise there. We all know in the real world, when you cut programs, it changes the academics, and when you add programs, it has the opportunity to increase academics. So again, reach out if you'd like to read those white papers.
Great, thanks, Tricia. So let's talk about a third potential consequence of just looking at cutting expenses, once again, to offset revenue impacts. So enrollment. Enrollment is probably one of the key metrics that you guys as charter leaders think about. How many students you're serving, how much impact are you having on the community? So let's walk through 2 different situations. Remember, the gray throughout the theme of this PowerPoint is the plan prior to COVID-19. So you could think about that, you as charter leaders normally probably set 5-year budget forecasts. So think about this as their 4-year plan prior to COVID-19. This school, we're still on the same example in California, was looking to grow from 630 kids to just under 700 kids in fiscal 21, and then was looking to continue to increase enrollment incrementally every year through fiscal 23. But now let's look at what the most, can you actually go back for just a second, Michael? Thank you. Now let's actually look at what's going to happen with enrollment if you simply only cut expenses to offset the budget impact. Well, you can see in fiscal 21 that there's no difference between the gray and the blue. But as you look out into the later years, you can see a pretty steady decline in drop off in total enrollment at the school, and that's happening for a few distinct reasons. If you remember what Tricia was walking through, she was talking about the most likely candidates for cuts that you will have to take. One is reducing staff. She gave you a number of potentially up to 15 staff members. And keep in mind, I haven't said this metric yet, but this school has about 70 to 80 staff on hand across all the different positions. So that's a significant reduction. So mathematically, if you're operating a charter school that's got full classrooms and you eliminate teachers that operate in those classrooms, you're actually forcing yourself not to be able to have as many students enrolled. So that's one perspective. The second factor that's offsetting this even further is the second part about what Trisha walked through. It's potentially getting rid of programs that make you unique. Schools come to us all the time looking for new ways to build out their athletic programs and their arts programs, all the things that draw people from your community into your school. As soon as those programs start to get eliminated, the students will actually most likely walk out the door as well, because the things that attracted them in the first place are no longer part of the program. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, over my 7+, actually, yeah, this slide. Thanks, Michael. So over my 7+ years sitting in the charter school space, in the financial industry, I've probably talked to hundreds of executive directors, and there's one common theme that they all have. They care. They simply actually care about what they're doing. I don't think I've ever been invested into, I guess I could call it a community where people are so inherently tied into their mission about what they are trying to do that they oftentimes don't think about what they're doing as running a business. They think about it as, supporting a program, supporting a community. They're always talking about the students they serve, and they're in it for the right reasons. So the whole point of that is, if I could, get you guys to virtually raise your hands on the phone, I'm sure you would all raise your hand high and say you didn't start a charter school just to constantly be under pressure and having to make hard decisions, having to lay off teachers, and spending every month trying to figure out how you're going to make payroll. You got into this business for all the right reasons. And what we're trying to allude to is that there's not always an easy decision or one decision that fits all, but we want you to think about all the options you have at your disposal to get to where you want to go, not only next year, but all the years ahead. So we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about what did the world look like prior to COVID-19. It sure looked a lot better. We talked about what does the path look like of taking no action as a charter school, even though there's action being forced upon you through budget cuts and deferrals. We also talked about probably the thing people think about first when they're facing a series of recession or less money coming into you as a charter school, which is cutting things from your budget. But what if we looked at a fourth option? So the fourth option is actually looking at utilizing financing as a tool and sticking to your original plan of how much money you're going to be spending on your school and your program. So you can see we're keeping the same graphical representation of cash balance over fiscal 21, and we're comparing and contrasting the two most likely scenarios that you are thinking about as a charter leader. So the light blue line has not changed. Once again, that is just cutting expenses to be able to survive through fiscal 21. You can see that cash is positive all year. The dark blue line is financing with no expense cuts. So you might look at this graph and say, they don't really look that different, but there's a few very stark differences between the two. The first is, remember, line number 4, the dark blue line, you haven't cut anything out of your program. You haven't let go of any of your teachers. Line number 3 is you've made a lot of really difficult decisions, but you're still staying afloat. So even though they look the same, they're actually very, very different situations. The other thing that's worth noting is that if you utilize something around financing, it can be an easier way to keep your cash reserves stable. Everyone knows that if you can predict cash, life is a lot easier. One way to predict cash is to utilize some form of financing where you can actually pad your reserves and know that you're going to have money in the bank in case new things happen, in case enrollment declines or new deferrals or new budget cuts come out throughout the year. So utilizing financing as a tool, essentially what I just said on the last slide, you can still achieve the original mission and the original goals that you previously created. So what do I mean by that? What I'm simply saying is, if you look at these three different bar colors we have laid out here, we're looking at projected enrollment from today all the way through fiscal 21. And we're comparing the three different scenarios that we've talked about over the last few slides. The gray and the light blue are the exact same. We just walked through that a few slides ago. But what I want to draw your attention to is look at the differences, or lack thereof, between the dark blue bar charts and the gray. And remember, this is enrollment. So what is that telling you? That's telling you something very interesting. It's saying, even though the budget's being reduced by 10%, even though deferrals are happening, if you utilize financing as a tool, you can actually achieve your original vision for the next 3 fiscal years without removing a single penny from your budget. You utilize and retain all of your staff. You retain all of the students that you want to serve, and you retain all of the programs that you originally envisioned you would keep in your school. So that's a very powerful statement to make. The one thing you're probably asking yourself is there any cost that is too heavy for me to be able to accept to utilize financing? So let's actually look at that. Because I know oftentimes financing gets a bad rep for, especially in the charter school space. But if you think about anything that occurs in life, anytime you want to take a step up from your current situation, you generally have to utilize a resource to get there. If you're going to buy a home, I would say the average person doesn't have enough cash to do that all by themselves. They actually utilize financing to get to a better potential path by taking a step today through financing. So let's talk about the example we've been walking through over the last 10 slides or so. So this bar chart here on the left is showing what the actual incremental cost would be that you would spend money on in your budget. So you can see that in fiscal 21, this charter school in the example has a total expense base for the entire fiscal year of $9.8 million. So remember that their budget is, from a revenue standpoint, is being reduced by 10%. So over $1 million is being cut, and payments are being delayed. So what we're saying is, by adding $78,000 on a base of 9.8 million, you can keep all teachers, all students, all programs, and still be successful with increasing your total expenses by literally 1%. So let's look at a few other metrics. Probably the three most important that we should talk about is enrollment, the number of staff you have, and your total revenues. So this is at the end of fiscal 23. So 3 years from now, hopefully when the recovery, we're thinking maybe a little more V-shaped and not as long as it was in the past that Tricia walked through at the beginning of this webinar, this is what we project these two distinctly different schools would look like at the end of fiscal 23. The scenario, if you chose the path today to simply just cut, nothing else, just using expense cuts to get there, it's an option. It's definitely an option. But you can see that enrollment is going to be lower, 530 students. Staff is going to be significantly lower. You have about 30 less staff on hand. And revenues are also significantly lower by about $4 million. On the other hand, in the dark blue bars, that is utilizing financing and, once again, not having to cut anything, but actually investing back into your program. You can see that enrollment north of 750, so it's your original projection. Staff is over 80, and revenues at 11 million.
Thanks, Matt. So to tie this all up, and we have a couple slides to do that, I want to bring you back to where we started, which is surviving and thriving, right? Hopefully, what we've shown you is an opportunity to look beyond mere survival and provide you a path forward in thriving, right? I think I was thinking as I was listening to Matt that the metrics charter schools as businesses need to use to stay alive are enrollment, staff, and revenue, right? Those are the metrics Matt just mentioned, and they're what you hear those of us that work with us at Charter School Capital talk about a lot. But really, I know because I've been on your side of things, at the heart of it all, we're trying to educate students, support communities, and create job satisfaction for our staff and teachers, right? Those are the metrics and the areas we want to focus on. And so that's the part, I think, if we can take care of the metrics that keep us financially flush, we can really focus on those things that enable us to thrive. So I just wanted to point that out because I know sometimes we use metrics differently than what charter schools. We really want to pay attention to our students and education and job satisfaction and community enrollment and involvement. So thriving provides students and support to families and the community. I want to tie this all up. We talked about 4 different potential paths forward. And the question we asked is, which school would you be proudest to lead? I think that's a fairly easy answer. And what we've said is, prior to COVID-19, that's no longer an option. The world is much different than it was just a few short months ago. And then taking no action, that results in fairly swift closure. You might be able to stay alive for a year or 2, but that it may only be a few months. So we really spent a lot of time on, path forward 3 and path forward 4, which are expense cuts and finance. And so this, again, table shows what Matt showed in a graph. If you have expense cuts, you ultimately reduce your enrollment, you reduce your staff, and you reduce your revenue. And through financing, we're showing that you can increase your students' enrollment, you can increase or keep your staff the same, and increase your budget. Because I am who I am and I work with so many charter schools and I come out of the operator side of things, I think that there is really option 5. And option 5 is a combination of expense cuts and financing, right? So this is a good opportunity in our world today to choose to cut some things that maybe aren't working the way you want them to. Maybe you have programs that you thought were going to be amazing, and it turns out that staff and students don't really like them. I think, software licensing and certain things, maybe they aren't working the way you wanted them to. Maybe the arts program isn't really turning out to be what you want it to be. So this is an opportunity to cut some of those. And same with staff. Maybe you found that you don't need as much janitorial support or as much curriculum development. So this is an opportunity to kind of look at your expenses and make cuts where it makes sense, make changes where it makes sense, and then go through the financing so that you are in a great position to thrive. So that's the piece that I just wanted to share is I want you to be able to maintain your mission through the situation and to thrive. I know we have a couple of questions, and then I also want to open it up for questions beyond that. So let's see.
Hey, Tricia, do you want me to tee up this question for you?
Yes, please. I was just trying to read it. Go ahead.
So Kareem just asked us, I think, a really good question. He said, most charter schools have lines of credit. Are you suggesting other financing beyond LOC's lines of credits as an option to fill the gaps?
We are. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would say everything is very unique depending on your own situation. So I really think the key theme of what we're trying to say is not inherently around financing or expense cuts. I think the theme we're trying to say is you have to know what is ahead of you, both in the short run and in the long run. So you might have a line of credit that is exactly what you need, and you might be able to scale that according to next fiscal year, depending on what kind of budget cuts and deferrals you're facing. But maybe the line of credit is maxed out now and you know that you're going to need something with double that capacity, or maybe you need something with lower cost or more flexibility. I guess what I would say is anytime you're looking at financing, weigh your options and don't always just think about it as an apples to apples comparison. Sometimes certain vehicles have better, less restrictive qualities that could be better for your school. So it's really dependent on what you have, but I would just say reach out to the organizations you're looking at and see what they all can offer, and make sure you think about it not in the short run, but also in the long run.
And Kareem, we will go ahead and follow up with you. We have a great one sheet on different financing options that can give you some pros and cons. So I'll make sure our account and client services team reaches out to you with that one sheet that I think will be helpful to adding some more to that question as well. Trisha, did you want to add anything to that answer?
I think, if you are a school that has access to financing, I think you're actually really in a great spot and very fortunate. There are a lot of charter schools out there that don't feel like they have easy access or already have access. So I think that puts you already a slight step ahead. And like Matt said, I think, flexibility in financing is probably one of the most important things that a charter school, or any school for that matter, should be looking at.
Thanks, Trisha. Well, we've answered all the questions in the chat window. So I first want to thank both of you for taking the time this morning and having a chat with all 200 plus charter leaders that joined us today. You've got our contact information right on your screen right now. If you have any follow-up questions, it's growcharters@charterschoolcapital.org. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, we are recording this session, and we'll make sure that you have that recording as well as the slides and contact information for our team this afternoon in your inbox. And I would encourage you to continue to follow us on social media again at Charter School Capital across Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and at Grow Charters on Twitter. We're answering questions there, sharing resources from the National Alliance, as well as a number of other partners of ours. And we'd love to continue the conversation there. Thanks so much for joining us today. And again, a big thank you to Trisha and Matt for leading the conversation. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.